Libya's government is angry at the United States. It accuses U.S. soldiers of kidnapping a man in Tripoli who's suspected of belonging to Al-Qaeda. The U.S. raid on foreign soil is drawing attention to the group's growing presence in the country since the fall of Muammar Gaddafi. Why is Libya becoming a safe haven for a number of armed groups, and how much of a threat are they to the region? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Jane Dutton. He's been wanted by the FBI for more than a decade with a $5 million bounty on his head. Anas al-Libi was captured by US forces on Saturday. He's suspected of planning the bombing of 2 US embassies in East Africa in 1998. Libya's Prime Minister Ali Zaidan is now demanding answers from Washington. He described al-Libi's capture as a kidnapping, and he's insisting on an explanation for why American special forces carried out a raid on Libyan territory. But US Secretary of State John Kerry defended the military operation and had this message for Al-Qaeda.
We hope that this makes clear that the United States of America will never stop in its effort to hold those accountable who conduct acts of terror, and those members of Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations literally can run, but they can't hide. We will continue to try to bring people to justice in an appropriate way, with hopes that ultimately these kinds of activities against everybody in the world will stop.
Well, let's talk about this further with my three guests. From London, Con Coughlin, defence editor of the Daily Telegraph. From Washington, D.C., Richard Weitz, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute. And joining us via Skype from Tripoli, Faraj Najem, Director for Salam Center for Africa Research. That's a think tank affiliated to the government of Libya. Faraj, let me talk to you because I believe you've just been in a meeting with some government members. The government is clearly furious about what happened on their soil. They're calling it a kidnapping. What is their concern? What do they plan to do about it?
Well, the government is helpless. I don't think they can do anything, but it's furious. It's been accused by its people that it's implicated in the kidnapping of a Libyan citizen from the Libyan soil. It's, again, this has been perceived by the public as an American piracy. You know, they just land and pick up a Libyan and they go. I mean, this is not, it's seen as something unacceptable totally.
And you say they're complicit. Is that because of reports that those who arrested him had Libyan accents? Is that true?
Well, it's widely believed that without the Libyan assistance, this man could not be picked up. So the Libyans do suspect either the government or some of these agencies are conspiring to kidnap this man and take him to America. So they could not have easily landed and taken him. And his wife was interviewed. She made it very clear that the men who picked him up, they spoke Arabic with Libyan accent. I even saw a little footage of the kidnapping was recorded by the Libyan intelligence. So there is something fishy here.
Okay, maybe Richard can clear that up for us. Richard, what are you hearing about this? Did the US work with the Libyan government?
There has been no public statement to that effect, and I don't think there would be, because there's a bit of a concern in Washington as well as in Libya itself that the government is seen as being too pro-Western, too closely attached to the Western powers that intervene militarily to overthrow Gaddafi. And so it's better if in public the government attacks the U.S. for violence. It's like the Pakistani government attacks the U.S. for violating its sovereignty and so on, even if in private they're collaborating with the United States in these counterterrorism efforts. Again, the Pakistani analogy comes to mind here. We've got the same situation going on there.
Con, you nodding?
I am, yeah. No, I agree entirely. I mean, I think you know, if the Libyans probably knew that this man was in Tripoli, and they had an opportunity to act, and you know, they can't really complain when one of the world's most wanted terrorists is detained, because this man not only poses a threat to American interests, he also poses a threat to the future of Libya, because no doubt he's associated with al-Qaeda and all the other Islamist groups who are trying to undermine the new interim government that is trying to establish some kind of authority in post-Gaddafi Libya.
If he was considered such a threat, or is considered such a threat, it seemed that he was going about his business. I mean, he'd been captured, dragged from his car, but it seemed that he wasn't frightened of getting caught. Why is that?
I suppose these people like al-Libi have lived the life of Islamist terrorism for coming on 20 years. I mean, this is a man who has not only been implicated in the terrible bombings of the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998, but his name came up a few weeks ago with the Kenyan shopping mall atrocity. People were saying he's been involved in that. So, you know, he's got a long track record of involvement in this world. So, you know, at some point he will have seen a lot of his fellow militants killed or captured during the past 20 years. So it was really a question of time before he suffered the same fate.
All right, let's talk a little bit more about al-Qaeda in the Maghreb and the sort of impact it is having on Libya. Since Gaddafi's death, almost every embassy in the country has been attacked, but the most prominent assault took place last year against the US consulate in Benghazi. The raid resulted in the death of the US ambassador, Chris Stevens, and 3 other embassy staff. Richard, what emerged from this is that it's not just al-Qaeda in the Maghreb that's operating there. Other groups seem to have been involved in this US embassy attack in Benghazi. How worrying is that, and what does it suggest about the way al-Qaeda is operating in Libya?
Well, I think just more broadly in Africa, there's a broad concern that al-Qaeda is not so much active itself, but basically providing encouragement at a minimum, and perhaps logistical and other assistance to a range of radical groups that want to target Western governments and their local allies. So we have the example of Somalia raid recently. We have what happened in Benghazi and Tripoli. There's concerns about Nigeria, about Mali, and so on. So there's just a range of possibilities. Whenever there's civil strife, lack of government authority, there are going to be some radical groups which will be able to acquire arms from various sources and use them against a whole range of targets. And that's been a big problem we've seen throughout much of Africa, given the challenges some of the governments there face.
Okay, we will talk about what's happening in the rest of Africa more in just a moment. But Faraj, tell me what the government is doing about this growing problem of the al-Qaeda in Maghreb in Libya itself. Why is that happening?
Well, the government is struggling with the armed groups here. They're not necessarily al-Qaeda or al-Qaeda affiliates. You know, in Libya, post-Gaddafi, we just inherited a country that literally was littered with so much arms, more than 6 million. So you've got plenty of arms in the hands of Libyans. And therefore, sometimes they do behave, and you see them as the al-Qaeda do behave, but they're not necessarily attached in any way to al-Qaeda or any of the Maghrebian or the African groups that we are talking about. So there is a problem. I don't think the government is capable of solving this on its own.
How much support does it get from the US?
Well, the US, I mean, gratefully, they helped us in toppling Gaddafi. So did so many other NATO members and neighbors.
But very little since then.
But post-Gaddafi, everyone seemed to have walked away from Libya. And that's why Libya is struggling as it is right now.
Richard, do you think the US has had a hand in assisting al-Qaeda grow in places like Libya? The fact that they went in, got rid of Gaddafi, and then left?
You can make that argument. Certainly, we've heard that argument about Afghanistan originally. The U.S. went in, helped the Soviets leave, and then just walked away for the most part, and that allowed the growth for extremism. We've seen perhaps that occurring in Libya, that it's a lot easier to mobilize resources behind an active conflict, and then when it ends, tension tends to wander. There's a fear we're going to see the same thing in Syria. If the insurgents ever come to power and the U.S. and its allies succeed in removing Bashar al-Assad, there's a good possibility that the kind of government that replaces it will be worse. We end up with an al-Qaeda type regime. So this is a reoccurring problem. The fact that in many places the alternatives to the existing authoritarian government, which the U.S. doesn't like, as in Libya with Gaddafi or in Syria with Assad, is going to be a more radical Islamist regime, which could be even more threatening.
Colin, this is clearly a problem, isn't it? If you've got a country like Libya, which is unstable, there is no force helping Libya, that it becomes the perfect breeding ground for these type of militant groups.
Well, Jane, earlier this year, the British Prime Minister David Cameron warned during a visit to Libya that the greatest threat to Western security was the development of what he called ungoverned space. And you see this in North Africa, you see this in Somalia, we've seen this in the past in the tribal areas of Pakistan and in southern Afghanistan. And what happens is that Islamist militant groups establish bases in these areas and use these bases to attack the West. And so the West has this very difficult problem. It wants to intervene, but under international law, its options are limited. But ultimately, you know, if you're going to deal with the leaders of al-Shabaab, the leaders of al-Qaeda and people like Mr. al-Libi, then, you know, you're going to have to sort of turn a blind eye to international law and act in your national interest, which is what the Americans have done in Libya over the weekend.
And that's when sovereignty and the issue of sovereignty goes out the window, does it?
Well, it's an interesting area. I mean, the Americans will argue that their sovereignty was undermined when Mr. al-Libi and his people were involved in bombing the embassies in 1998, and that they have every right to defend themselves and take whatever action is appropriate. But there will be others, human rights activists, that will say that this was a breach of Libyan sovereignty. I think the Libyan government is making a similar argument. And so, you know, you go round in circles. But the point is, you know, Mr. al-Libi is regarded as a very serious terrorist. There's £5 million on his head. And I think a lot of people will be glad that he's now in custody.
Richard, what sort of information do you think the US is hoping to get from al-Libi?
Oh, all sorts of information. And that's the problem with the drone strikes. Is often you kill a terrorist, but you don't have the advantages of when you have a special force team go in and seize tapes and all sorts of documents, as they did with the bin Laden raid. I imagine they're going to want to know about what he did in the past, what his affiliates did, who are his allies, finances, local collaborators, foreign supporters, all sorts of facts you'd want to get from somebody. If they're lucky, they will. But I imagine it's going to be a bit of a struggle. I'm sure he's going to resist, prevaricate, and so on. But it's much more valuable if you can do this. But of course, it has the complications. When you use a drone strike, the government will protest, and that's it. When you actually go into territory, seize somebody, take them away, you risk casualties. It's a much more harder affair to play down, and so on. So there are trade-offs in how they want to do it, but this person appears to have been worth the extra effort.
You talk about drones, and what has struck me about this latest excursion, as well as the action on the same day in Somalia against al-Shabaab, is that drones were not used. Does this suggest a new way of operating on the ground for the US?
No, I'd be careful about that. The U.S. Counterterrorism strategy, it's much more richer than is often portrayed in the media. There's a military component. It's mostly the drones, just because there are few casualties. At least on the U.S. side, they can operate very low visibility. They're hard to defend against. But you sometimes have these kind of special forces raids. There was the bin Laden affair. There's probably a couple others which we don't really know about yet or have not been confirmed. Often they're CIA-sponsored snatch and grab by the locals, in which then the person will be renditioned. But much more broadly, you've got a strong effort from the U.S. to work with the local security forces to build them up. That sometimes has a military component in terms of training and equipping, but it often includes working with the locals to try and improve their delivery of public services, try and work on education, de-radicalization programs. There's a very comprehensive effort. So what we see here, in this case, we saw the special forces, and it may or may not have been an accident. They occurred simultaneously in two places. Often you'll hear about a couple drone strikes turned simultaneously. But against this backdrop with the punctuated incidents, you have this broader backdrop of a large range of U.S. programs supported by those and complemented by those of other countries and the United Nations.
Okay. Just not Libya, it seems, though. Up until earlier this year, though, al-Qaeda in the Maghreb used northern Mali as its base for operations. That changed after the French military intervened, which left many people wondering where they'd gone. Well, it now appears that Libya, in particular, southern Libya, has become a new base for al-Qaeda fighters. It's an area largely out of reach of Libya's poorly equipped and unorganized security forces. Al-Qaeda members now seem to be using their new location as a springboard to carry out operations across the entire Sahel region. In May, al-Qaeda in the Maghreb was blamed for a twin suicide attack in Niger that killed at least 20 people. Niger's president warned that the group is planning more attacks from its stronghold in southern Libya against countries like Chad. Faraj, I mean, what do you think this means for the region, the fact that al-Qaeda is moving from Mali to Libya? Do you think it's going to be a lot more effective, especially seen, as you said a little earlier, that the government has no control over this area?
Well, I beg to differ. I think our intake is entirely different from what's being suggested. One of those who was present with us was a commander of the Desert Shield, who looked after the southern western border of Libya. And he made it very clear there are no camps in the south there, and there is no presence at all of al-Qaeda there. As a matter of fact, those who were in Mali, they are seen as pro-Gaddafi, and they were fighting with Gaddafi during the revolution. And therefore, they could not come to Libya because they are with Libyans, but also with militias here. So I yet to be convinced that there is a presence of al-Qaeda in South Libya. And I think it's not to say that the borders is 100% secured. No, there is a problem with illegal immigration, with drug trafficking, but most certainly al-Qaeda isn't present or does not have physical camps in the south of Libya at all.
Con, who do you think would be more effective in battling terrorism on the continent? I mean, obviously the US is there, but I mean, could ECOWAS play a stronger role?
Well, I was in Mali earlier this year, soon after the French deployed there. And of course, there was the French were replaced by an African Union force working with the European Union. And they seem to have done quite a good job of stabilizing Mali. You don't hear much about Mali now, but of course these groups that then move on. You look at what's going on in Nigeria with Boko Haram. You look at what's going on elsewhere in the Sahel.
Yeah, I mean, they're on a roll,
aren't they? You find Libyan fighters. They are. And also, you find a lot of Libyan jihadists or jihadists from Libya, not necessarily Libyan citizens, linking up with Syria. A lot of arms have come from Libya to Syria. And as we know, the Nusra Front is a very Islamist organisation and is really at the forefront of the opposition in Syria. So all these things are interconnected. And of course, Syria links into Iraq, and as you can go on and on and on. So really, I mean, I think what we need is a sort of a widespread collaboration between indigenous groups in Northern Africa. We've seen, for example, groups in Libya that want to work with the West. Again, we've got the Kenyans working with Western forces to try and stabilize Somalia. And so, and of course, the West is trying to support the moderate opposition in Syria. So, what we need is stronger ties, working together with local communities, giving the communities that want democratic governments, giving them the support so that they may thrive, and the Islamists are put on the defensive.
And giving them jobs and infrastructure, I should imagine.
Jobs, money. I mean, if you look at the root of the Arab uprisings, which have caused a lot of these troubles, the driving force was actually economic, not democratic. People want jobs, they want a better standard of living, and they want to get rid of corrupt and authoritarian governments. Well, the Islamists actually don't really offer much different. So, if the West can find a way gently, because I think a lot of people are very suspicious of Western motives, particularly after what happened in Iraq. So the West needs to tread very gently in the way it works with these groups. But, I think if we work together, a lot of these more extreme Islamist groups can be neutralized.
I mean, Richard, do you agree with that? Do you see an end in sight? Because I should imagine after the siege on that mall in Kenya that Al-Qaeda and al-Shabaab got a real boost to its image.
Well, I think what we're going to see, I mean, it's hard for me to envision an end to terrorism in Africa or anywhere else. I mean, I think it's always going to be with us. But certainly you've seen over time rise and fall of different groups. I mean, al-Shabaab came out of the Union of Islamist Courts. It had suffered a lot of defeats after doing some well, and now may or may not be on the rebound. You've seen this with many other terrorist groups. What I think the hope is to keep these threats manageable, isolated, minimize casualties, prevent the more serious threat we saw with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, where you had a country turn into basically an international center and for managing a global terrorism operations. I mean, I think that if they're localized and separated, it's going to be easier to keep them under control. But we're always going to see these kind of casualties. We see these in the U.S. too, these mass shooting incidences, although they're often not even linked to any form of terrorism. It's just an individual, a crazed individual or group.
Faraj, any idea what Libya is going to be doing? I mean, I know the country has problems with drug traffickers and smugglers, and it is a very hard area to police. But what is the country planning to do to try and put a stop to making militants and their groups attractive to people in your country?
Well, I think now we're going to be engaged in a national dialogue on the direction that the country is going to take. We know that the Islamists do not have support in the Libyan street. This was manifested in the election that we saw, where the Brotherhood got only 17%. So there is a problem, there is a big gap between what the Islamists want, but also what the entire nation wants. And therefore, I think we need to engage in a dialogue and talk our differences out. But what we need from our friends, especially the Americans, whom we are grateful to in helping us in toppling Gaddafi, not to do what they did over the weekend, because that can only aggravate the situation and make Libya, make the position of the Libyan government very difficult, and will just embolden those extremist positions within the country.
I suppose there's one little positive here, Richard, and if you could answer this briefly, that even though Al-Qaeda's footprint is growing in Africa, it does seem that it's harder to attack outside of their strongholds.
Yes, I mean, you've seen threats to North and South America or Europe, but it's not anywhere the level of threat that you used to see coming out of the AFPAC region. I mean, I think we've been so far fortunate. But as I think you alluded to earlier on, this could change, particularly if the U.S. hand is seen as being a bit overbearing, or the French or whatever, in these kind of counterterrorism operations. So that's why I think we're going to see these not occur that often. Okay, gentlemen, good talking to you. Thank you very much, Con Coughlin, Richard Weitz and Faraj Najem. And of course, thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want to, of course, you can send us your feedback. Just email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.